Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlene Van Bleeman. I'm a program manager here at the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Thank you for joining us for the launch of this three-part Climate Change and Health Project ECHO series made possible through a grant from the Energy Foundation. The Project ECHO model aims to build a bi-directional learning community where participants learn from content experts and each other. Discussion and interaction throughout the session are encouraged. This program has been designated for one AMA PRA Category 1 credit by Atlantic Health System and has been approved by the New Jersey State Nurses Association for nursing continuing professional development. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's session will last 1 hour. The session is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants. The information to access the recording will be sent to you in an email. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation in order to minimize any disruptions to the presenter. If you have questions related to the presentation, please put them in the chat box. As a friendly reminder, please communicate in a courteous, respectful, and professional manner while utilizing the chat box. In order to support the growth of the ECHO movement, Project ECHO collects participation data for each tele-ECHO program. CME, MOC Part 2, and CNE credits are being awarded for your participation in this session. Links to the CNE post-test and CME evaluation will be emailed at the conclusion of this session. Once your quiz is submitted, your credits will be issued. You can expect your certificate emailed to you within 30 days. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our two hub leaders who will be guiding discussion and offering expert advice throughout this ECHO series. Dr. Shannon Eccles is a New Jersey native with a lifelong passion for science, nature, and health. She attended medical school at Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine in Bradenton, Florida, and completed her pediatric residency at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital. She's currently a pediatric hospitalist at St. Barnabas Medical Center. Dr. Eccles is co-chair of the NJAAP Committee on Environmental Health and Climate Change, as well as a founding member of the New Jersey Clinicians for Climate Action. Our other hub leader is Dr. Jane Kraft. Dr. Kraft is board certified in pediatric critical care, general pediatrics, and medical quality. She graduated from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia and completed her residency in general pediatrics at the Medical Center of Delaware. She came to New Jersey following her critical care fellowship at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and is now at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, where she's a pediatric intensivist. Dr. Kraft is also president of the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. She is a former co-chair of the Committee on Environmental Health and Climate Change and also a founding member of the New Jersey Clinicians for Climate Action. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jerome A. Paulson is Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics and of Environmental and Occupational Health at the George Washington University of Medicine and Health Sciences and at the Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health. He spent the majority of his career teaching and practicing primary care in the system that bridges Children's National Medical Center and George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. He also taught in the G.W. Milken Institute School of Public Health. He is the founder of the American Academy of Pediatrics program on climate change and a founding member of the Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action. He works as a consultant at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, fostering the development of state CCA organizations. Dr. Paulson holds a degree in biochemistry with honors and general honors from the University of Maryland and a medical degree from Duke University. He did his residency training in pediatrics at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and Sinai Hospital, both in Baltimore, as well as a fellowship in ambulatory pediatrics at Sinai Hospital. He lives in Alexandria, Virginia with his wife, Gwen Paulson. Without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Paulson.
Well, thank you very much, and hello, everybody. It's good to be here, and I appreciate this opportunity to present to you all today. Let's see. Okay, so I want to share my screen and go to PowerPoint and share. Okie dokie. Here we go. All right, so we want to talk about the link between air pollution, and I include pollen in the broad category of air pollutants, and the influence between air pollution and asthma and how that's all changing as a result of climate change. So I have no potential conflicts of interest, but I do come with an opinion, a knowledge that climate change is a fact. We're all dealing with it, and I'm trying to do something about the problem of climate change. As a result, I'm the founder, as mentioned, of the American Academy of Pediatrics program on climate change, a founding member of the Virginia Clinicians on Climate Action, and a consultant to the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. So that gives you an idea of where I'm coming from, and we'll go from there. So first of all, let's talk about fossil fuels and air pollution. Fossil fuels can be solids, liquids, or gases. Solid form most commonly is coal. There are various kinds of petroleum depending upon how they are produced. And then for gaseous fossil fuels, we generally think of methane, and it's called natural gas. And I've put it in quotes here, and I will put it in quotes throughout the presentation because natural may imply that it's harmless or at least has less harm. But in fact, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so we need to limit the use of methane just as we need to limit the use of petroleum and the use of coal. Air pollution varies over the time of day. You know, our factories getting started in the morning, our cars starting to drive in the morning, are people turning on their air conditioning or their heat in the morning? Is everybody getting home from work and cooking dinner? Our indoor air pollution, it's relatively rare, certainly in the United States, to have people using coal for heating. It's much more common for people to use natural gas. And then in the rest of the world, the use of biomass, cow dung and other substances are very common, both for heating and for cooking. And of course, we have to remember that unfortunately, tobacco smoke does continue to represent an indoor air pollutant. And again, as I mentioned, pollen. As outdoor air pollutants, transportation, the burning of fossil fuels for manufacturing and other purposes, agriculture, both in terms of the dust that it can produce and also in some circumstances with the cultivation of rice, the cultivation of sugarcane, and perhaps other crops. It's very common for the fields to be burned at the end of the season, and this creates a great deal of air pollution. Forest fires, of course, produce a lot of air pollution, aside from the death and destruction that they produce from the flames themselves. And then again, there's pollen. So when we think of burning fossil fuels, we want to think of what happens, what's produced as a result of burning those fossil fuels: carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, oxides of sulfur and nitrogen, volatile organic compounds, and then unburned hydrocarbons. And then those are the gases, but we also need to think about the particles that are produced in burning fossil fuels. And particularly with forest fires, we need to think about particulate matter. The coarse particulates PM10s, fine particulates, PM 2.5 and smaller, and ammonia, which then in the atmosphere, things cling to the ammonia molecule and make particles. So I want to make it clear how small these particles are. Here you see a human hair, some grains of sand, and then PM 2.5, much, much smaller than the size of a human hair, and PM 10 even being smaller than a human hair. And particle size matters. The large particles are generally filtered out in the nose and throat. So think back 10 or 20 years ago, and you might have been driving down the highway behind a big old dump truck, and you get that great big plume of black smoke coming out of the dump truck. Those coarse particles that made up the black smoke got filtered out in your nose and throat. It's what you couldn't see. And today, without the black smoke in that exhaust, was still what you can't see, that gets further down into the lungs. And with the particles less than 2.5 microns, not only do they get into the lungs, but they are small enough to go across the vascular bed and into the blood vessels and then into the circulation around the body. And while it's not so much maybe a problem for children, for adults who have atherosclerotic disease, either in their coronary arteries or in their brain, the presence of those ultrafine particles can set off clotting and result in myocardial infarctions and strokes. There are also autonomic dysfunctions that occur, and for those particles that stay in the lungs, oxidative stress as a result of those particles is an important part of the process of damage to the lungs that occurs as a result of air pollution. So why are some of these gases so destructive? Again, in the past, it was more common to hear about acid rain. And in fact, the oxides of sulfur and the oxides of nitrogen produce sulfuric acid on the one hand and nitric acid on the other hand. So you wonder why limestone buildings and statues were dissolving when acid rain was a greater problem. And you can see why air pollution attacks the lungs, why air pollution can be irritating to the lungs or damage the lungs. You're breathing in, and your patients are breathing in mists of acid. The volatile organic compounds and the oxides of nitrogen that occur as a result of combustion in the presence of heat and sunlight create ozone. And ozone, again, is another oxidant, another irritant, and again, attacks the lungs and causes damage. There are many, many homes in the United States and around the world where methane is used as the gas for cooking and for heating. And while we think of this as a relatively benign situation, it is not. And particularly for our patients who have asthma, the use of methane in their heating or in their cooking produces byproducts, particularly oxides of nitrogen, that then can go on and irritate the lungs. In a a study or in a review of 31 studies looking at cooking gas and or heating. It was associated with a relative risk of asthma of 1.17 with the confidence interval there, as you can see. And also for women who were exposed while they were pregnant, there was an increased risk of low birth weight and stillbirth for those who used methane for cooking and for heating. So that sets the stage, I hope, for what we're going to talk about in terms of the air pollutants other than pollen. We'll get to those later. And so I want to turn now more specifically to asthma. And I'm not going to talk about all of the management of asthma. I'm not going to talk about the management of asthma at all. But I am going to talk about some of the pathophysiology, and you will understand, I think, the implications for management as we think about air pollution, pollen, and asthma. So as everybody knows, asthma is results from inflammation in the airway that ultimately leads to smooth muscle constriction, bronchial wall edema, and bronchorrhea. And asthma is the most common chronic disease of childhood. So air pollution, whether it's gaseous air pollutants or particulate matter, leads to the development of reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species, and they cause inflammation and can produce asthma de novo or lead to asthma attacks in those who have asthma. For the allergens, it's more of an immunologic response that leads to airway inflammation. And then we know, particularly with our kids, viral infections may set off wheezing in their own right. And then for the kids who have asthma, viral infections can precipitate asthma attacks. And viral infections cause inflammation as a result of eosinophilic responses. In a number of studies, the development of asthma has been associated with exposure to motor vehicles, black carbon, oxides of nitrogen, and particulate matter that come from the exhaust of motor vehicles, and exacerbations of asthma are also associated with exposure to motor vehicle related pollution. Again, the oxides of nitrogen, the particulate matter, carbon monoxide as well, and of course, ozone. There is some interaction between air pollution and allergy. Air pollutants seem to enhance the sensitization from aeroallergens. In mice, diesel exhaust particles enhance nasal production of IgE from allergens, and both those that the mice were already sensitized to and new allergens. And inhaled pollutants are pro-inflammatory. Pollution-induced IL-6 is likely to inhibit regulatory and teleogenic immune pathways. So all of these things speak to an interaction between pollution and allergy. For those who have asthma that's not on an allergic basis, exposure to PM 2.5 in in mice in experimental settings, led to inflammation without an allergic response. Again, the oxidative stress from these pollutants play a pathologic role in asthma. And even in patients just walking beside a roadway, obviously exposed to the pollution from the traffic on that roadway, McCreener et al. Found elevated sputum myeloperoxidase level as a result of the exposure to the pollutants. Air pollution opens the way for respiratory tract infection. Air pollutants impair mucosal function, phagocytosis, and immune adaptive responses. So let's shift a little bit to wildfires. We certainly have wildfires in the United States as a huge problem. We don't have kangaroos. This is a picture of wildfires occurring in Australia, another country with a huge problem as a result of wildfires. But wildfires occur around the globe, and wherever they occur, they adversely impact the health of the people, not only who live close to the wildfires, but who may live a very far distance downwind, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. The fire is just off the picture here, and this is an image from one of the satellites, but you can see that the plume of smoke is traveling quite far as a result of this fire. And in 2012, wildfires contributed 20% of the fine particulate emissions in the United States. And in certain years since then, with a major increase in the frequency and severity of wildfires, I wouldn't be surprised if this number is not greater. And in areas proximate to the wildfires, this number is much greater. And then, of course, you have, the wood and other things that are burning are fossil fuels in their own right. And so you have not only the fine particulates, but you have carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, oxides of sulfur, nitrogen, etc. So this is the coastline of California, and these were a number of wildfires that were taking place in proximity to San Diego. And using their Medicaid database, they looked at kids 0 to 4 presenting to the emergency department during these wildfires. And for any respiratory diagnosis, there was an increase of 70% in the kids presenting to the ED. And for asthma, it was 136%. For very young children in 0 to 1 age range, the situation was even worse, with a 243% increase in asthma and a 77% increase in all respiratory diagnoses. So we'll turn now to some thoughts about allergies. When you grow plants in a greenhouse, you can control the amount of CO2 that those plants are exposed to while they're growing. So 400 parts per million CO2 represents the current situation. 600 and 800 parts per million represent situations that we may get into in the future if we don't put a stop to climate change. And you can see that plants that grow in higher CO2 levels produce more pollen. So as climate change gets worse, as CO2 levels go up in the atmosphere, our patients who are allergic to grass pollen are going to have worse situations. And likewise, for our patients who are allergic to ragweed pollen, here you have plants that were grown in a greenhouse with 280 parts per million of CO2. This was the level just after, whoops, where'd that go? Just after the start of the Industrial Revolution around 1900, the levels in 2000 and the projected levels for 2060. So again, our patients who are ragweed sensitive are going to have more of a problem as climate change gets worse. Pollen is worse in cities than it is in suburban areas. In a study done by Luziska and colleagues, planted some ragweeds in Baltimore and then planted some ragweed in the suburbs. The CO2 levels, because of increased production, increased traffic in the urban areas, were higher, and because of the urban heat island effect, the fact that buildings and concrete and blacktop, all the areas of the city where there are not trees and grass that lead to a cooler atmosphere. The city was 3.5 degrees warmer than the suburbs, and as a result, the ragweed grew faster, flowered earlier, and as I showed you in the previous slide from other studies, produced more pollen. So as climate change progresses, not only will everybody who suffers from allergy to these pollens have a situation that is worse, but those who live in urban areas will have even more of a problem than those living in suburban areas. So here's a map of the United States, and what we're looking at in the top map is the fact that there will be more pollen production in most parts of the United States as time goes forward. And in the bottom, we are already seeing early, or this is not actually as time goes forward, this is now, we're seeing more pollen production throughout the United States in most cases, not all, but in most cases. And we are seeing an earlier pollen season. So, think about it this way. When does the first frost, and here in Washington, D.C., where I am, the first frost this year almost this past winter, almost didn't occur. It was very, very late, but what that means is that the plants continue to grow. And likewise, if last frost in the spring comes earlier, then as a whole, you get a longer growing season. Longer growing season plus higher CO2 means more pollen. And another way to display this information, increased temperature, increased pollen, increased temperature, earlier start to pollen season, increased temperature, total length of the pollen season is longer. And again, this is the total length of the pollen season. You can't talk about any environmental health issue without talking about environmental justice. Every single environmental health issue that you deal with in your clinical practices are, by definition, environmental justice problems in their own right. The EPA definition of environmental justice, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulation, and policies. That's the EPA definition. But the other thing to recognize is that communities of color, low resource communities always have exposures that are greater than well-to-do or Caucasian communities. Polluting industries, polluting facilities have intentionally been placed in biopic communities. So we have to recognize that every environmental problem, excuse me, is an environmental justice problem. So let's look at Pittsburgh, for example. About 70% of kids were exposed to PM 2.5, higher than the national level, and higher than even the mean level as described by the EPA. And this was associated with increased odds of having asthma in Pittsburgh relative to the rest of the country by 58%. So Pittsburgh has many post-industrial areas with poor people who are trapped in those post-industrial areas, people who are exposed to more pollutants, and children who have more asthma. In Harlem, there were a number of papers a couple of years ago looking at asthma in Harlem, and more than a quarter of children in Harlem had asthma versus about 8% nationally. And again, many low-income people living in Harlem, many people of color, many homes that are in poor condition. So there's more cockroach and dust mite feces, more cigarette smoking, again, as a result of the poor condition of the housing, more mold and mildew. And I'm sure many of you have had the situation, as I've had when I was in clinical practice. A mom comes to me with pictures on her phone of mold growing in her apartment as a result of a leak from the apartment above, and her child having intractable asthma in spite of all of your best medical management, but your medical management is not going to be enough. You have to be able to help that family get out of that building or get the mold renovated and get the building renovated and the mold removed from the building. In Harlem, it's not only indoor air pollution that's an issue, but again, as a community with a lot of minority individuals and a lot of low wealth individuals, there's much more outdoor air pollution as a result of diesel buses and trucks. 6 of the 7 bus depots in all of Manhattan are located in either Harlem or East Harlem. I know, again, here in the United States, here in the Washington, D.C. area, a non-governmental organization came to me a couple of years ago. This was a group that advocates for the homeless, and they wanted me to help oppose the creation of a new homeless shelter. Now, why in the world would an NGO that advocates for individuals who are homeless come to me for help trying to oppose the creation of a new homeless shelter? That proposed homeless shelter would be less than 50 feet from a railroad track that runs, it's the track that runs from DC to Baltimore and up to New York. So if any of you have taken the train to DC, you've come in on that track and gone out on that track. It was directly across the street from a bus depot. It was around the corner from a trash transfer station with diesel trucks coming in all day, every day. It was around the corner from a cement plant. So the air pollution the air pollution that those people would have been exposed to had that homeless shelter been placed there would have been unreasonable. And there are more kids in that group with asthma to begin with. There would have been horrendous problems. Thankfully, the homeless shelter was created, but it was not created there. In California, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which is part of the California EPA, has created a software package called Cal Enviro Screen. And it allows one to develop a score depending upon various factors related to location in the state of California. And as that score got worse, for every 1.6% increment of the score getting worse, the mean rate of pediatric hospitalizations went up with a risk ratio of 1.016. And you can see the confidence intervals there. For every unit increase in racial and ethnic segregation and diesel particulate matter, again, there was an increase in asthma 1.1% and 0.2%. Central Valley of California runs from fairly far up north in California all the way down to Bakersfield here in the south. It is known as the salad bowl of the United States. It's where many of the fruits and vegetables that we who live very far from California consume on a daily basis. And it's an area that is highly polluted as a result of the use of pesticides for these growing these fruits and vegetables, and the use of pesticides in this region is associated with a higher prevalence of asthma among kids. So what can we do? I refer you to a project called Project Drawdown. Here's their website. They have looked at a large number of potential interventions for climate change and assessed how likely they are to be effective in reducing carbon or other greenhouse gases. And if we build more wind turbines and reduce food waste and eat a plant-rich diet. So, you know, we want our patients to eat a plant-rich diet anyway, and that's good for them and it's good for the environment. We want clean energy. We want a carbon-free production of energy as soon as we can get there. We want people to walk and bike. That's good for their health and they're not polluting and it's good for the environment. Electrified transportation, when the electricity comes from renewable resources, is good for the environment. Next time you want to buy a car, think about buying a zero emission vehicle. Again, eating less meat. If the whole of the United States had 1 day a week where they didn't eat meat, we would save 1.2 million tons of CO2 per year, or the same amount that's produced by all of France. The wide use of electric vehicles, you can see one plugged into a charging station here. By 2050, $72 billion in avoided health harms, 6,300 lives saved annually, 93,000 fewer asthma attacks, and 416,000 fewer lost days of work. Rental assistance, getting people out of deteriorated housing, leads to decreased asthma attacks. And finally, one of the most important things you can do is be an advocate. Most of you on this call are members of the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Between them and the national AAP, you have splendid vehicles for doing your advocacy work. It was mentioned, New Jersey Clinicians for Climate Action, a newly formed organization that specifically speaks to climate action, trying to get policies in place that will reverse climate change. There are a slew of other organizations that you can join. And I'm not saying that any one of these is better than any other. They're all good groups to think about joining, but be an advocate. Find a group that will help you magnify your voice so that you can be an advocate for climate change. And at this juncture, I'm happy to take questions. We can move on to the rest of the program.
So I don't see any questions in the chat box. So I think we'll just present very briefly someone who you may see in your office. If you are a school-based professional, you may see them in the school. So just to get us thinking about the questions that perhaps we don't normally ask when we see children who are having an asthma exacerbation or difficult to control asthma. So Shannon, I'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So our case to think about, we have a patient's mother calling your office requesting an albuterol refill for her 7-year-old asthmatic son. She calls you to say he used up the last of his inhaler last night, and you think that this is kind of concerning because you prescribed him an inhaler with refills only 6 weeks ago. So you ask her to bring him into the office later today to be evaluated. So she also mentions that he's been waking up with shortness of breath or coughing only about once a week since late March, but the past week it's been every night, despite using his inhaled corticosteroid reliably as you have prescribed it. So later that day, he comes into your office, and he's not in any distress. He has no fever, but he's breathing about 24 breaths a minute. Occasionally, he's sniffling. He has a little bit of clear rhinorrhea. And then when you listen to his lungs, he's got bilateral and expiratory wheezing and a dry cough whenever he tries to take a deep breath as you ask him to. Next slide, please. So the mom tells you a little more information. She does say that in the past, most of his asthma attacks have been occurring during the fall and the spring. Those are when he's worst. And they don't have any sick contacts right now. They have no pets at home, and the usual things that we would ask for asthma. If there's anybody smoking inside their home, if they have any carpets. And mom does mention that her eyes have been itchy and kind of watery for the past week ever since the Pine Barrens fires started, even though they live a few towns away from the Pine Barrens. But on that note, their apartment is 2 blocks from a bus stop in an urban environment. And they did recently turn on their AC unit, which is in the window for the first time since last summer. So, sorry, next slide, please, Charlene. So what can we do to help this patient? And what are the other questions that we could ask to help figure out if there are environmental triggers for his asthma or for any patient's asthma?
Anybody who has a comment on this or a question, please feel free to unmute yourself. And then I would just ask you to briefly introduce yourself and comment. And if I don't hear anybody, I actually do have some questions. This is for you, Dr. Paulson. You know, most of us, as you know, was indicated on the slides, when we ask about asthma risk factors, we all ask about pets. We ask about smoking in the home, smoking out of the home by people who live in the home. We tend to ask about carpets. We ask about heavy drapes, but you know, if we're really thinking about the air that's being breathed, you know, in a busy office, you don't have a lot of time to ask about all of the environmental stuff. Are there some additional key questions that really should be a part of the standard interview conversation with a family of a child who has asthma?
I think that, you know, particularly for New Jersey, where so much of the state is heavily urbanized, you've got various corridors through the state with very heavy traffic, a lot of truck traffic. You've got ports in New Jersey where there may be a lot of diesel exhaust from trucks moving materials either to the ships or from the ships. So I think asking about proximity to roads, to bus stations, to places and situations where the child is going to be exposed to either motor vehicle related pollutants or industrial pollutants. You know, what does the family smell? Are there odors that are wafting from some of the chemical plants that the family knows that every time that odor comes, their child is going to wheeze? Now, you know, you can ask the question, you can get the information. You're not likely, certainly in the short run, to be able to shut down that chemical plant. it does create a situation that none of us likes to get into, where we have a piece of information and we feel powerless to act on that piece of information. And that gets me back to the advocacy part. You might not be able to do anything about that factory to help that kid that day, but what can you do as a community for rent subsidies that might enable that family to move someplace where they would have less exposure to traffic or chemical odors or whatever it is that seems to be setting him off? What can you do as an advocate to increase the incentives in New Jersey for people to drive zero emission vehicles, for example? Here in Virginia, we were just able to pass some legislation that increases the incentives for individuals who buy zero emission vehicles and actually requires motor vehicle dealers to stock zero emission vehicles. One of the problems we've had in Virginia is if you went to an automobile dealership and wanted to buy one, they were hard to find. So now, once this law goes into effect, hopefully they'll be easier to find.
One of the things that had been suggested at another session similar to this was the posting of no idling signs. New Jersey, there actually is currently by law, school buses are not permitted to idle outside of schools. One of the things that was found is that often they're idling right by the air intake for the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system for the school. And so, kids were getting headaches at the end of the day because these school buses were idling outside of the school. So New Jersey actually does have a law regarding the school buses, but often you see lines of cars outside the school that are idling, or people in parking lots waiting, maybe perhaps outside your office, who are idling. And sometimes a no idling sign may sound small, but it's one step.
So two thoughts about that. I think you're absolutely on the right track. Couple of things to maybe take it further. So where are there other concentrations of diesel vehicles? Where are the bus barns for the transit system in your community? And are those bus barns, for example, close to a low-income housing site? In the ports in New Jersey, what are the regulations about idling there? And then if you want to take the school bus issue another step towards clean energy, would be to advocate for electric school buses. Electric school buses, by definition, don't have any tailpipe emissions, so the issue of idling becomes moot if they are charged from zero emission electric production facilities, wind and solar. Then they have no emission. They have a zero greenhouse gas footprint. And those batteries can actually, because there's so many school buses and they're not used at night and they're not used in the middle of the day, those batteries can actually serve as battery backup systems for the utilities to help them have energy on call at different times of day. And then they might not need to burn fossil fuels because they can draw energy from the bus batteries, say at at 6 o'clock at night when everybody's doing dinner and laundry, and then recharge those batteries at 2 o'clock in the morning while they're still plugged in. So that's another thing for pediatricians in particular to think about in terms of school buses.
Those are great ideas and great ways to advocate. One of the other issues that comes up is the people that have asked in the past about is where do I get information about air quality? So we actually have two good resources. One of them I sort of mistyped a little bit in the chat box, but airnow.gov collects information across the United States, but you can actually drill down not just to New Jersey, but your particular town or region to see what the air quality is, and it color codes it based on both ozone as well as particulates. And so you can see, you know, if it's red, the recommendation is everybody should probably stay inside. You know, if it's yellow or orange, then we start to get into the gray of if you have lung disease like asthma, you probably shouldn't be taking gym outside that day for the kids. So that's updated on a regular basis. So every day you can see what the weather is. And one of the interesting things last year or the year before when they had the large Pine Barrens fire is that you could see the track of particulate matter and the wind current, and you could see how far away from the Pine Barrens that was affecting the air quality. The other one, the second one in the chat box, actually the search domain doesn't belong there. It's just when I copied and pasted there it happened, but it's the New Jersey adapt.rutgers.edu. Oh my goodness, I really made a mess of it in the chat box. But it's the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance out of Rutgers, and they have a number of maps that can help you look at your community and look at things like, you can look at poverty, you can look at the flood risk, you can look at a wide variety of things that are contributing to the environmental injustice across the state. And then I think, Shannon, you had a report from nj.gov that is helpful.
Yes, so for air quality, well, I have a few things to say about that. There's nationwide, there is an EPA recommended program for school districts who want to participate that's called the Air Quality Flag Program. And I actually believe that you can use the airnow.gov to link to it, and schools who choose to participate can raise different flags each day that are color coded based on what the air quality is. So it's supposed to warn, I guess, the kids, maybe their parents, if they happen to see the flag, if it's not somebody who's taking a bus to school, and the teachers, and especially, I guess, the gym teachers or anybody who'd be taking the class outside, so that the kids who are affected with asthma or have sensitive airways can be prepared and maybe sit that gym class out or prepare in other ways. And then there's a big New Jersey specific report that is available on nj.gov. It's called the New Jersey Scientific Report on Climate Change. The first edition came out last year. I don't know how often they publish a new one, but New Jersey, they actually found that New Jersey is warming faster than the rest of the American Northeast. We have climbed, our average temperatures have climbed 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895, compared to 2 degrees for the rest of the Northeast, and compared to 1.5 degrees overall worldwide. And as you and Dr. Paulson mentioned, with New Jersey having so many paved areas, so many densely populated and urban areas, and so much concrete and asphalt in those areas and fewer open spaces, there's a lot more, well, we already talked, we touched on this with the environmental justice, but those areas and the fact that New Jersey is warming up higher than the rest of our neighbors, we have a lot of advocacy to do for this.
I put the link in the chat box to that report so that you all can access it directly. And I see that we only have 1 minute left. So what I'd like to do is, Dr. Paulson, any last thoughts? And then I'll turn it back to Charlene for the thank you and reminder about the next session.
Nothing, but just thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope that a lot of the people who are listening will join New Jersey Clinicians for Climate Action and become active in this field. And if anybody has any other questions, you all can feed them to me and I'll try and answer them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kraft, Dr. Eccles, and Dr. Paulson for your time and expertise. On behalf of the New Jersey Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Again, we also thank the Energy Foundation for their support. As previously mentioned, CME, MOC Part 2, and CNE credits are being awarded for your participation. Please follow the links in the chat box or scan the QR code on your screen to complete the CNA post-test or CME evaluation. The links will also be emailed to you tomorrow if you are unable to complete them today. Once your quiz is submitted, your credits will be issued and you can expect a certificate emailed to you in the next 30 days. We hope that you will join us again on May 21st for our second session on vector-borne illnesses presented by Dr. Meg Fisher, and on June 28th for our third and final session on extreme heat presented by Dr. Samantha Dute. Thank you all and have a great afternoon. That concludes today's session.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in.